Good morning, and thanks very much. It's a real honor to be here. If you Google my last name, all you get is pictures of my daughter. She's the rock star in the family, go USA, and my son just successfully actually defended his PhD at Stanford 2 weeks ago. So the most important thing in life, the kids are taken care of and doing well. It really is an honor to be here. I want to start off this morning with hopefully modeling some elements of great learning that we all can share, taking a little bit of a risk, sharing, connecting with people here as well as outside this room, and also some reflection. And here's the risk taking. I've never done this particular little activity with a group exactly like this before, but we're going to try it anyway. How many Twitter users do we have in the room? Raise your hand high so that people around you can see if you're a Twitter user. Okay, take a look around. Here's what I'd like us to do is to take a moment of sort of centering and reflection. In January, I was on a Twitter chat, a Sunday Twitter chat. It's called the Sat Chat West Coast. There's a Sat Chat here on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. And the conveners asked people to think about one word that describes what they want to really focus on for the rest of the year. What's that one word they'd like to exude in their classroom or at their school? And the takeaway was a little bit surprising. And so I started logging these in, and now at workshops I've done, various workshops and events I've done, I've been collecting these. And I'd like to do this here, and I'd like you all to be part of this sort of crowdsourced activity. If you can think, and we're just going to take about a minute and a half to do this. If you can take a minute to just reflectively think, the best way I can put it is this: of what do you want your school to reek? What's that one word that just describes what you want your school to absolutely exude? Let's take a minute of quiet reflection and think about what that is, and then I'm going to ask you to either tweet it out using those hashtags or tell the person who was raising their hand near you what your one word is. So in about 30 seconds, let's get real noisy in here, sharing with each other, what's that word that describes what you want your school to reek of? Okay, for all of those of you who are actually checking your emails and not tweeting, that's okay. And if you didn't quite get it done, go ahead and carry on, put those up later on. Let me show you why I think this is such a valuable exercise. I've collected now, and this clicker we've got a lag time problem with this clicker. Now my clicker decided to not work, dog. There we go. I've collected now about 500 of these words, and when I get to about 2,000, I'm going to publish it. Here are some of the words that have been crowdsourced so far. And I have two takeaways from this. One is that so far in these, as I've been downloading these, no one has said anything about test preparation, having our students be great at physics or chemistry, and only one or two people out of 500 have said that the word is grit. And yet grit has managed to put it, there's a grit right there, right? Okay? So that's one out of several hundred here. And I'm not saying it's a bad word. It's a word that has percolated into many schools around the country. And what I find is that a lot of people don't actually agree on what that word means. And so words matter, vision matters, how we articulate our vision matters. I don't know where this is going, but you just participated in a great crowdsource event that at some point I'll publish, and we'll find out whether Jewish day schools have similar words with other educators around the country. Here's where I want to start my talk. The world is changing at a remarkable rate. I'm not going to re-argue that discussion. As far as I'm concerned, that train left the station a long time ago. As educators, this curve can describe a lot of things. One thing it describes is the increase in the sum of human knowledge. By some calculations, the sum of human knowledge will be doubling every year by the year 2020. Now, I was not a very good student in math. I actually stopped taking math in about 10th or 11th grade because the teachers kind of turned me off to it. But doubling every year is a number that I understand. That's a very, very big number. We are in the knowledge business. And if human knowledge is doubling every year soon, that is going to have a significant, that is already having a significant impact on what it is that we do. So, as far as I can figure out, education for millennia, perhaps 100,000 years, has largely been about one thing: the transfer at its foundation, the transfer of knowledge from a teacher to a student. Since people first got around campfires, probably 100,000 years ago, that's been the fundamental core of education. Whether that person transferring the knowledge, that teacher, was a parent or a shaman or the best hunter in the tribe or a healer, that has been that relationship of transferring that knowledge from the older generation to the younger generation. That fundamental reason for education has now been significantly changed and disrupted and irrevocably. Our students can get basic knowledge right here on their phones, and 4 billion people in the world carry something that looks like this today. Right now, those are not necessarily smartphones, but in a few years they will be. And so we have to think about what does that mean in terms of our role as educators if our students can acquire that knowledge in more direct fashion. There we go. Oh boy, this is annoying. We might want to try the other clicker, dog. Technology. I love blaming it on the techies. So the world has actually gone beyond a tipping point in something very fundamental. I was able to sit down with a woman, Shoshana Zuboff, who was one of, I think was the first tenured woman at the Harvard Business School back in the day. She's now retired. She gave me about 5 or 6 hours of her time at her home in Maine a year or so ago. And she helped me understand that we have reached, probably surpassed, a global tipping point in something absolutely fundamental in the relationship between producers and consumers, and that cuts across virtually all industries. And here's what she said. In the past, large organizations and companies have essentially said to us, the consumer, this is what I have to sell, so you're going to buy it. And today that's turned around 180 degrees across virtually every industry we know. We, the consumers, say, this is what we want to buy, so you're going to sell it to us. The sort of iconic or metaphoric example of this is in the music industry. 8 or 9 years ago, Sony Records said to us, here's this thing called a CD with 12 or 14 songs on it. You're going to buy it for $12 or $16, and we all did. Steve Jobs and Apple and iTunes came along and said, no, you can buy songs one at a time, you can select whatever you want, and within about 3 years, the US music industry, in terms of music sales, lost about 80% of its revenue. We see that same thing across so many industrial sectors. In retail, we no longer necessarily just go to Penny's or Macy's or Sears and buy what's on the shelf. We shop online, or we shop on eBay or on Amazon or something like that. In our investment portfolios, we don't always just do what the stockbroker tells us to do. We have our Ameritrade account or our Schwab account. We're doing that, making those decisions ourselves. In healthcare, it's completely mystifying how that smorgasbord of options works, but there's a smorgasbord of options available to all of us. And education is no different. In my home district, my home area near San Diego Unified, the geographic area that encompasses San Diego Unified, includes about 800,000 students. This year, 50% of those students will not go to their neighborhood school. Now, I don't know what that number was when I was growing up, when some of you were growing up, but it would have been in small single digits. You went to your neighborhood school, unless you maybe were Catholic or Jewish, or your parents were rich and sent you to the independent school. But 50% of kids in that area will go to something other than their neighborhood school. A charter school, a magnet school, a choice school, a faith-based school, an independent school. They'll hack school their own education. They'll do it online. They'll do it in a hybrid environment. And so there's been an explosion of choice, and we in education are part of that evolution, what Shoshana calls a mutation of the relationship between consumers and producers. Which one's plugged in? Are they both plugged in, Doc? Let's see which one. How about neither one? And now it's going to go about 6 slides ahead, isn't it? Now I have no idea which slide I'm supposed to be on, but let's skip to this one. So after a dozen or 14 years working in a large independent school, I decided to take advantage of the one thing that almost every educator wishes they had more of, which is, I've asked that question to thousands of people and I've never heard one word other than time. It's the one that we all agree on. I begged forgiveness in advance from my very patient wife, who at that point we'd been together for about 30 years. We're coming up on our 30th wedding anniversary this year, but thank you. And of course the most important part of that sentence was I asked my wife in advance. And I packed up my Prius and drove around the country for 89 days. I visited 64 schools of all different types. None of them, by the way, were Jewish day schools, which I disclosed to the conveners here when they invited me. I got 48.3 miles per gallon in my Prius on the entire trip, which is a great accomplishment. And I really had 3 questions that I was asking when I visited these schools. Those questions. I wanted to know what innovation meant to those schools. We've been hearing this word innovation in education for perhaps a decade. Nobody had ever actually told me what that meant in terms of education. So I was going and saying, what does innovation mean to you? How are you doing things differently than you might have done 5 or 10 or 15 years ago? How do you think you're preparing our students better for a future that is less predictable, perhaps more ambiguous, perhaps more complex than it has been in the past? What are some of the obstacles you've had in terms of changing your organization, organizational change? And share some successes. It was not the easiest trip I've ever been on. There were some long days of trying to figure out where I was going to be staying the next day and what bad food I was going to eat. There was the day 4 days into the trip when I was driving across the Kansas plain and all the lights on the dashboard came on the car all at once in the middle of a cold rainstorm. But every day I got to be re-energized by visiting a school where they said, Grant, go look at what we're doing here. We are so excited about this. We're so hopeful that this is going to percolate across our educational system. Look how fired up these kids and students are about their learning. And I got to chronicle all that. And so I came back at the end of the trip and I asked my wife's forgiveness one more time. We have a nice big wall in the family room and I asked her if I could screw a couple big bulletin boards into that wall, which she said yes, and the bulletin boards are still there, so that I could start organizing my thoughts. And here's very briefly, some of what I saw on that trip. I think our schools are becoming much more dynamic places. We're not asking our students to sit in the same spot in the same part of the classroom, in the same row and aisle at their desk every day. The kids are getting up out of their seats, and I say that there's a little bit of noise and chaos is actually a good thing. I visited a school, it was actually a very young kids, a little preschool. There was a boy and a girl in there. This school was called Take It Apart Tuesday. They also had a Make It Monday, but this was Take It Apart Tuesday, and this little boy and girl were sort of beating the heck out of a computer keyboard with a hammer and a screwdriver to see how what this thing was made of. And this little boy especially was popping these keys off with his screwdriver and they were flying all over the place. And he was so excited. He wanted to find out what was inside this keyboard. And I turned to the teacher at one point and I said, well, that's a little risky, isn't it? You know, you got kids with little 5-year-olds with hammers and screwdrivers going around. And she said, well, you know, you're right. But we're learning something about the interaction between fingers and hammers. And what better place to learn that than right here in a nice, safe, secure environment. Our schools are becoming much more adaptive, and by that I mean adaptive to the world, to the changes in the world around us. I'm going to show you some data here in a little bit that suggests that what educators want more than anything else, and students and parents, is to break down this artificial barrier that we have in our mindset between how the world works and how schools work. The world does not work according to subject material and a certain quantum amount of time in a classroom. Our teachers and our students want to be much more interdisciplinary, work on big, broad themes. I visited one school in Boston where the students told me, said, Mr. Lichtman, at our school, we don't have to turn our math brains off and then turn our science brain on and turn our foreign language brain on. All those themes are woven together at the same time in everything we do at this school. And of course, that's the way the world works. We're becoming much more creative. The students that I visited, there's so many schools that are creating a makerspace or an innovation laboratory, someplace where the students can get up and actually create something. There's one story, I don't tell all my story, the same story all the time, but the one story that I love more than any other was visiting a school in Atlanta, and at an elementary school, the students had had a room called, I think they called the Idea Studio or the Design Studio, something like that. It was just a classroom that they'd torn out to the walls and filled with stuff that the kids could make things out of. And they brought in a little second grade student for me to interview, and we were sitting on those little bitty chairs that little second graders sit on, which means my knees are up somewhere against my chin. And I asked him, I just said, so what is it that you do in here? What do you do in this space when you and your classmates come in? And he kind of screwed up his face for a second. And he said, well, we ideate and prototype, and we build stuff, and we fail forward and we fail fast. And all that I could think of was that kid is never going back into the box of education that we grew up in, where it was prescribed, where it was handed to us, where we were expected to largely regurgitate what was being told us by the teacher. That kid had been given the tools, or in fact the tools had not been taken away from him and his classmates, and going forward they're going to be so comfortable with an environment where they're expected to be creative and to design and that sort of thing. And so at the very end of the trip, there's a really long drive between Dallas, Texas and San Diego. And if you made that drive, it's a long drive. A lot of Diet Cokes to get through that by yourself. I started asking myself, so what are sort of the common themes? What did I hear? Can I distill this down? And the slides are doing whatever they want to do. Yeah, let's try this. So can I distill this down to one set of, forget that, it'll do what it wants to do. And I really got it down to sort of finally down to one word, and that word was Dewey. Even though, whether we're secular educators or faith-based educators, we know that John Dewey and the other giants of the progressive era of education really were telling us one thing, teaching us one thing, and that is that students learn best by experience, which leads to some form of engagement, which leads to some kind of passion, which leads to learning. And that, at every school I visited, where all I was asking them was, what are you doing? What are the programs that you're doing? What are your teachers and students fired up about the most? When I synthesized that, I really had to take away that John Dewey would not have been uncomfortable with a single thing that I saw, not a single one of those classrooms if maybe he could use an iPad or a laptop, something like that. But the theory was there, and it was being put into practice every day. And the synthesis of that was, as I started organizing the stacks of yellow pads that I'd written on and the dozens of hours of video interviews that I'd taken, and trying to organize in my mind what were the actual driving elements at these schools that I'd visited, these are some of the words that came to mind. These ideas of adaptability and dynamism and self-correction. And perhaps it was because of my background that was shared with you a little while ago as a geologist and environmental scientist. These are the words that describe the workings of a natural ecosystem. These are the words that describe the characteristics or drivers of a natural ecosystem, whether that ecosystem is a rainforest or a grassland or a pond. And they're fundamentally different than the words that we use to describe a more industrial system. Scalable, repeatable, This thing is just being a real pain. I'm so glad this is being filmed, you know? I should know this slide deck by now. I just talk and forget the slides, huh? This is just not good. Here we go. There we go. I do want you to look at these side by side. So words like contained and controlled and scalable. This is how we humans design a system to work. And this is the system that was designed in the 1850s to meet the needs of the industrial and social revolutions of the 19th century. But they're fundamentally different words, and I think they operate at a fundamentally different level than what people were telling me they want our schools to be like. And I don't think you can tweak at the margins the industrial age system. That system that says we're going to put students into a quantum packet of subject and time and classroom, and we're going to move along a conveyor belt that's calibrated to move at one increment per biologic year of students and expect to achieve the outcomes that we want when what we really want is something that looks more like a natural ecosystem. And so I think these two systems there has to be fundamental change, not tweaking at the margins. This is going to get really fun here. So I'll just leave it here. So people ask me, what do I think education looks like in the future? The first slide that kind of whipped through there was the image of a bunch of chairs sitting in a row. Yep, that's what we hope is largely in the past. And it's not in the past. In many schools, that's still what education looks like. I think this is probably a good view of what great education, great learning looks like today. The kids are up out of their seats, they're sharing with each other, they're working together, their learning is very visible, they're allowed to both create and learn the knowledge that is important for them. But beyond that, I think there's another evolution that we're embarking on. And if there's one image that I do kind of want you to be able to see, it's this one. Come on. There we go. No! No! How can this go like 3 slides at a time? Okay, come on. One more. Come on. Got it. Stop. There. This is if there's one slide that I'd really like you to think about and maybe get burned into your head a little bit, it's this one. Our world is right now going through a fundamental transition of connectivity. We are connected in ways that even a decade ago we could not even imagine. Connectivity allows a flow of ideas that becomes the currency of learning, it becomes the currency of human performance, it becomes the currency that we exchange with each other. I've coined a term for this sort of evolving neural network that's out there, and again, it includes everybody in the world, probably 4 billion people that have one of these in their pocket now. I've called it the cognitosphere. If you teach Latin or if you know Latin, people get upset because the Latin of that is really sketchy, but that's okay. The fundamental is that it is not going forward, it's not going to be the school with the largest endowment, the person with the PhD from the best university, the student who can get the highest scores in the SAT who will have the greatest impact. It is the individuals and institutions through which knowledge will flow, where knowledge is being created and shared, that will have the greatest impact. And if we can look at an analog from the 19th century, you can look at that figure and think about towns in Western North America, which ones prospered and which ones shriveled up based on 2 things. Where did the telegraph and the railroad lines, the communication avenues of that time and place and that century dictated whether a city or community became important or irrelevant. And as educators, I want you to look at that and say, we want our school to be relevant. We want our school to be important and significant in the future. We want our students to be at the center of those nodes, not off on some tangent somewhere as we work, as education evolves into something that's vastly more connected across time zones and across geography and across diversities of population. Sure, the computer's over there. That'd be wonderful. I said, so what holds us back from making this transition from largely an assembly line sort of industrial age model to the sort of things that I've been able to describe? The two greatest ones are the two impediments to change in any organization: fear and inertia. And those have special relationships in schools. In schools, we've always had a special relationship with a fear of failure. When you're a student, you fear that F on your report card, and teachers and administrators have always had a greater downside to taking a risk than an upside. And yet we cannot change, we cannot innovate without being willing to take a risk. And we're going to talk about that in some of my workshopping later on this morning. The other one is inertia. We, whether we're Jewish day schools, independent schools, or great public schools in America, have been doing a pretty darn good job at educating our kids for a long time. The problem is the world has changed, and so we can't stay the same. There are a couple of other things that hold us back that I found. One is something I ended up calling anchors. And the anchors that are holding us back, if we look at faculty in the classroom, are generally these. This is my classroom, my time, and my subject. This is why I teach, because this is my time to teach these kids this amount of material. When teachers start letting go of that, letting go of those anchors, that egotistical connection to that this is about me, and turn that responsibility over to the kids, many of them tell me the weight of the world is off of my shoulders. I'm now a co-learner with my students. I'm not here to preach to them or to hand them the keys to this knowledge. It's up to them to help acquire it. And the other real impediment that I find at virtually every school I go visit are these silos. We all know what silos means now. 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, in a room of educators, if we'd used the word silo, most people would be thinking about those grain elevators in Iowa. We know now what silos are in our working environment. The boundaries that keep us from being more connected to other individuals in the community, because we know it's black letter law in innovation and change management, especially in innovation and creativity. The foundation of creativity is connectivity, and if we're bounded by these silos, we don't talk to each other because, oh, we're faculty and they're administrators, or vice versa. We are prevented from our organization seeing that kind of change. Next slide, please. I'm going to do that. No, that didn't work. Next blue screen. How about next slide? There we go. There's another element of change that's really important, and that is that it's, again, black letter law that change is hard. If you're trying to change your school or organization or as an individual, change is hard. And I had that discussion with virtually every school that I visited for the first 2/3 of my trip. We talked about how difficult it was, how painful it was, the stages of grief, all that sort of thing, and then I'd go on to the next school. And right now I'm going to change the story that I normally tell at this point in my talk. Because what I normally tell about is a moment of epiphany that I had 2/3 of the way through my trip when I started thinking about, to me, what is really hard in our lives. And I thought to this audience, I'm not going to tell you necessarily what I think is hard, because this audience shares some common history and knowledge about what's really hard in our life. I will share with you, on the plane I decided to use this example. When my great-grandfather, whose name was not Lichtman, was Berkovich, left the Pale in 1880 or 1885 and made it across Europe in advance of the Tsarist agents and then made it to America, I think that was probably a pretty damn hard thing to do. And you all have stories like that in your lifetimes, in your families as well. What I came to at that point in time is that change in schools is not hard. Forget that. Change is uncomfortable. Change in our school, relative to what's really hard in our lives, changing schools is uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to me as a faculty member, as an adult in the system. It's not with the kids. They're down on all this. It's about us and the adults making those changes, and it causes us discomfort. If we can have those discussions at our school, the difference between hard and uncomfortable, I think it really helps the process. Let's see. So, how do we get there? How do we make these changes? Whoa, we get there really fast. So I think it's about building a capacity and a comfort for change. Boy, my pacing, if I were a comedian, I'd be terrible, huh? My pacing is just horrible with this. It starts with us asking what it is we actually want out of our schools. And I use this list of many schools, and I don't know how many of your schools have gone through a process of something like, what are the essential qualities of our graduate? What do we want out of our school? What's the philosophy? We have the 10 things we want. Many, many schools have done that. Many school communities have done that. And many of us end up coming up with a list that looks sort of similar. I use this list for one reason. It was generated by 3 groups of high school students. I asked them, it was actually 2 independent schools, 1 private or 1 public school group. I asked them very simply, what are the skills that you need to be happy and successful in your life? I gave them 3 minutes, and they came up with that list. So total elapsed time, 9 minutes to come up with that list. I think it's a pretty darn good list. The school I used to work at, we took a year of faculty introspection and discussion, and we basically came up with the same list. So as an extension of this, next slide, thank you. And in fora similar to this, whether it's groups of 20 people or 500 people, for 15 months, I gave people those same 3 minutes, and I asked them to write on a Post-it note a question that started with the words, what if, that might significantly change something at their school that they would like to see change. No other direction than that. And we would, in the workshopping, we'd use these Post-it notes. But then rather than leaving those on the wall when I left, I took them all off the wall, and on the plane home, or when I got home, I would type them into into a little database. The people on the airplane would look at me, what are all these Post-it notes doing? And at the end of 15 months, I had 2,000 of these from administrators and teachers and parents and students and business officers and academic deans from all types of different schools. I ended up with 2,000 Post-it notes. Once again, I got my bulletin board out and I started to put these into buckets to figure out what they were. It was a very subjective activity, but I did a pretty good job of it. I ended up throwing out about 150 or 200 of them because they were really higher order thinking things like, what if we fired Miss Brown, or what if our head of school wasn't such a jerk, or something like that didn't seem to correlate with a lot. But the rest, here's what was fascinating. By the way, I just published this in an article in Independent School Magazine. Some of you get that magazine. If not, it'll be online, and I'll be putting it on my resource page in the next month or so. I just published this article. But here's what it showed. And don't worry about this. I'm going to focus in on the top. What was fascinating was that all 1,800 of those Post-it notes, representing almost 2,000 educators, 70% of those what-if questions fell into just 10 categories. 70% fell into 10 categories. We all want the same things. And those 10 categories, I'll zoom in here in a little bit, are these. And I told you a little bit a while ago, what do we want? We want to be much more interdisciplinary. We want to learn according to sort of big themes of learning that takes place, more like the world around us. I can't see, what's number 2 up there? Student ownership of learning, have the students take more ownership in the learning. We want to revise our grading and assessment practices. We want to be more embedded in the community. All these things that I had seen on my trip were being reflected back when people were able to anonymously write these Post-it notes and say, this is what we want learning to be like. Now, I'm not saying that this is what you want learning to be like at your school. But it's an activity that we can go through in a very short period of time, in a matter of just minutes, with our community, with our parents, with our students, with our teachers, with our administrators, and ask, what is it? We get there by asking questions like, what if and how might we, not by asking some of the traditional questions. And here's the other big takeaway here for those of you, especially who are senior administrators at your school. I haven't seen your strategic plans, but I've seen strategic plans at a lot of schools, and virtually none of them include any of those topics. We talk about hiring and retaining the best faculty, raising money, balancing our tuitions with the financial capacity of our families, about building buildings, those sorts of things. And you have probably a set, the faith-based schools clearly have a set of, that I didn't mention there in your strategic plans, but very little of this, of what educators actually say they want, are embedded in our planning processes. So, what does innovation actually mean? And now I'm getting toward the bottom quartile of the talk here. What does innovation actually mean, I think? So, innovation is not, very specifically, is not about ideas. It doesn't mean we just have an idea and that's innovative. In fact, innovation, I'm not even going to worry about this. We'll go to the, innovation is not even about having good ideas. Schools are replete with good ideas. I have a great idea, let's try that. That's not innovation. Innovation, very simply and importantly, is about implementing ideas that enhance the value of your organization. And that's what my first workshop I'm going to be working on later this morning is about, is enhancing the value of your organization. If what you're doing is not enhancing the value of the organization, however you define it, you're not being innovative. And success is about sustaining and building that value over time. See if I can get to this slide. Which brings us to the question, hopefully, of so what is value? If innovation is tied to value, what is value? And I know in talking with some folks last night, certainly you study the value proposition of your schools. Hopefully you're studying the value proposition of your schools. Value proposition can have a lot of definitions. This is the one I like best for schools, having visited a lot of schools. I think a school's value proposition, very simply, is the difference between what you say you're going to do and what you actually do as viewed through the eyes of your customer. Value does not exist outside of your customer. And that's one of the other things we'll be working on the workshop today, is identifying who our customer is and how we actually know how their values, what they value, might be changing in this world that people like Shoshana Zuboff described as having some very fundamental changes occurring there. I think there are, actually I'm going to change this to one critical plane of innovation because I took a slide out here. This graphic has been used by a lot of folks. It was the first time a version of this was published was back in 1987. It's essentially articulates. It looks very complicated, but it's not. It essentially outlines key steps that are required for an organization to go through a process of change. And the important thing here is that every one of those steps, there are only 8 steps there, but every one of them is a potential weak link in the chain. Every one of them is critical to the stage. You can have great leadership. You can have established a great vision for your organization. You can build in a timeline and set goals. You can go through all that, and if you're not communicating effectively, the process doesn't work. Every one of those is a potential weak link. And so I've published this, and I've been working with this and refining this as I've worked with schools to identify what are the things we need to do, what are the actual tactics and activities we need to do on the stairway of innovation to ensure that we actually get from where we've been in the past to where we want to go in the future. And again, we'll be touching on a little bit of this in some of the workshops, but it's a complicated process, and I'll say that there are probably 3 elements that are required. It has to be systematic. It can't be one isolated bit at a time. It has to be synergistic. The process has to involve all elements of our organization, and here's the hard part, it has to be simultaneous. We have to be doing these things at a time when we're also carrying on our day job, which is actually running the school. People talk about building the plane and flying it at the same time. That's the reality. What's my time? 2 minutes. Okay, I'm going to finish up very quickly with one last very quick story and a challenge for you. I'm working with a small school it's a public school in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Very underserved population, 100% free and reduced lunch, probably 50% undocumented students, and the principal of the school, who was a West Point grad who grew up in this neighborhood, came back to his neighborhood, said, we're going to change these schools. He's an unbelievably powerful leader. We're going to change this school in 3 years. There's no question in my mind it's going to happen. He talks to us about the issues with the faculty, the issues with the community where there are low expectations, and blah, blah, blah. 2 weeks later, I'm at Palo Alto High School. Again, a public school, but the nearest thing to a private school that you can get in the public sector. Palo Alto High School, right across the street from Stanford. They need $25 million for a new gymnasium or something. Somebody from Apple writes them a check. 75%, 80% of their kids go on to 4-year colleges, and they all think they're going to Stanford. But again, the nearest thing you can get to a public, very, very well resourced, the farthest thing you could get from Ortiz Middle School in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And with the principal of that school, I had the exact same conversation I had with the principal at Ortiz Middle School in Santa Fe, New Mexico. How do you want to change? What do you want your school to look like? And what are the obstacles you're having in your community to getting there? And after 45 minutes, I said to her, this is the exact same conversation I had in Santa Fe, New Mexico, at a school that's completely different from yours. And is it okay if I write a blog tomorrow that talks about this? I said, there's nobody in the world that would say that Palo Alto High School is not a great school. And it's a great school. But I said, are you a leading school? Are you leading at anything? And she said, no, we're not. Please publish that so my superintendent reads it, because we want to be a leading school. And yet, Ortiz Middle School in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which no one would say is a great school. In fact, it's a poorly performing school. It's a very poorly performing school. I think they're a leading school because they're trying things in an environment that, where others would fear to tread. I raised this challenge actually here in Philadelphia several months ago at an Advis event, and I raised that challenge of, are you great or leading? And a gentleman in the audience said, and what about this? Are we successful or significant? And I went, whoa, that's a neat discussion to have. And the next day, and I challenge you to have this, I'm going to leave here, challenge you to have this with your students. Have your students and your faculty have this discussion. Have them discuss, what do we mean by great, leading, and significant? And where do we want to be as a school 10 or 15 or 20 years down the road? I apologize for the glitches in the slideshow. I really appreciate being here. I hope some of you will join in the workshops where we can go a little bit more in depth in this as the morning goes on. And most of all, thank you all so much for what you do on behalf of our kids.